call on Government Order of the Day number 4.
Tariff, Free Trade Agreement between New Zealand and the Republic of Korea, Amendment Bill, second reading.
The Honourable Todd McLeay.
Speaker, I move that the Tariff, Free Trade Agreement between New Zealand and the Republic of Korea Amendment Bill be now read a second time. And Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee for its consideration of this bill and the good work that they did, not only in consulting with the public on the earlier draft of the impact assessment, national impact assessment, but also the detail of this legislation. This is an extremely important piece of legislation for the House, Mr. Speaker, and for the country, because it amends New Zealand law to implement our obligations under this FTA, a free trade agreement that will help to level the playing field for so many New Zealand producers and exporters to Korea who work very hard to send goods there and are at a disadvantage because of tariff barriers that are in place when their goods arrive at the border in Korea. But more than that, they are a disadvantage to some of the countries that we compete with for production of these goods who also export to Korea. And that's why the government's free trade agreement, which I hope, Mr. Speaker, is still shared by parties across the House, the bipartisan approach to good trade policy to help New Zealand business and industry. That's why successive governments have worked so hard in this area to level the playing field for hard-working, diligent New Zealand companies and, of course, the people that work for them. So, Mr. Speaker, the bill will particularly amend the Tariff Act 1988 and notes to the tariff will note a tariff to add the Republic of Korea to the list of preferential countries that we trade with, and it also provides transitional safeguard mechanisms contained within the Trade Remedies chapter of the FTA so that they are applied appropriately under circumstances. I want to touch just on a few of the issues I think are important in this bill, Mr. Speaker, at least in the agreement and what the bill will implement. And the first is this, why is Korea important for us? Well, it's our 6th largest export destination for goods and services and our 8th largest import source of goods and services. Mr. Speaker, two-way trade between New Zealand and Korea in 2014 stood at $4.5 billion. That's significant for New Zealand and New Zealand businesses. The Free Trade Agreement is a significant development in our bilateral relationship with Korea. And, Mr. Speaker, what this does is it means that New Zealand companies are able to sell more produce to Korea, more goods and more services to Korea. They become more productive because these barriers that some around the world, when we look at free trade agreements, or at least the restriction of trade when it comes to tariffs, would say that they restrict trade. And traditionally, when we look at the evolution of trade around the world, that's what they were there for. Many years ago, the significant barriers that were in place with the European Union were to protect local industry, which we know can stifle innovation, but to restrict access for goods from others who produce well, as New Zealand does. Well, Mr. Speaker, this levels that playing field in as far as our relationship with Korea. New Zealand exports currently constrained by these tariff barriers. Without the agreement of the Korean market, our exporters currently pay approximately $229 million of duties every year. $229 million of duties on our goods that go into Korea. None of that is returned to the New Zealand economy, to these New Zealand businesses, Mr. Speaker. So on entry into force of this agreement, duty-free access will be bound in and tariffs eliminated on approximately 48.3% of exports. That's a saving of $65 million in duty in the first 12 months alone. So, Mr. Speaker, in the first 12 months of the entry into force of this agreement, negotiated by Minister Grosser with Korea, $65 million of duty will be reduced. That makes our producers more competitive, that makes them more productive, that returns more to them to invest in their businesses and to invest in their workforce. Mr. Speaker, under the agreement, approximately 98% of tariffs on New Zealand's current exports to Korea will be progressively eliminated. That means 98% of what we currently export to Korea will go in without a tariff upon it, without any barrier around cost when it arrives there. Extremely important. But that's only what we export at the moment, Mr. Speaker. As we've seen with other FTAs, particularly the China agreement, our trade with China has grown significantly. The agreement that's been put in place, the economic agreement with Taiwan, we've seen our trade grow significantly. $4.5 billion of trade with Korea is already significant. I expect, Mr. Speaker, with this FTA entering into force, we will see trade from New Zealand to Korea also grow significantly. There's one aspect of trade agreements that's not often spoken of, Mr. Speaker, and that's what happens when you don't have one. So let's take a situation, the situation with Korea, where others have entered into an agreement with Korea before we have. So what this means, Mr. Speaker, is we still have the same access, the same relationship, but some of these goods that we compete against actually get in there at a preferential rate compared to New Zealand. And so what that means is we end up competing on a platform that's less than fair. It means our access is eroded because of the preference of others. And it's as simple as this. If we take the kiwi fruit industry and their trade with Korea, a very important market for kiwi fruit, New Zealand kiwi fruit into Korea, they have faced tariffs of about 48% from memory into that market. Now, other countries of the world, Chile, for as an example, from memory also produces kiwi fruit, and they export there at a much lower rate, from memory around about 10%. So they have our producers in New Zealand at a disadvantage straight away, because the cost of our kiwi fruit when they get to the border are competitive, but when the tariff rate is applied, that competitiveness is no longer as obvious. Well, under this agreement, we'll see a significant reduction over a short period of time of the tariff rate against New Zealand kiwi fruit to zero, Mr. Speaker, right down to zero. At the same time, countries that we compete with that also trade with Korea, that won't be the case. So our producers now have an advantage over some of those others, and that's a very good thing. That will be worth, on average, from memory, $12,500 per kiwi fruit grower in New Zealand, cash in hand, and as far as the erosion or the taking away of this tariff. So that's very important. But the main point here I'm making, Mr. Speaker, is that actually without these free trade agreements, without us entering into them, without us moving forward with them, without us making sure that we remain competitive to others, when our competitors who are trade into markets that are important to us get a preference that we don't, for instance, if there's an agreement that we don't sign but they do, then over time, and it doesn't have to be a very long period of time, our companies in New Zealand, our producers, are hampered, they're held back, their trade is eroded based upon price. Well, the good news here, Mr. Speaker, is this agreement with Korea doesn't do that. In fact, it goes in the other direction. It gives us some advantage. Just finally, Mr. Speaker, on some of the substance of the agreement which this bill enacts through changes to legislation. A number of wide-ranging measures to help us facilitate trade both in goods and services, and also assist with investment flows, encourage cooperation in areas that we must work together. Investment flows in both directions. So the first around this is there are improved rules of origin, sanitary and phytosanitary rules, very important for agricultural production in New Zealand, recognition of standards, technical regulations and customs procedures. Now, these aren't tariffs, but these are all barriers that can have the same effect as a tariff if it makes access more difficult. It puts cost upon New Zealand businesses. So us moving forward with this is a good thing for New Zealand. Mr. Speaker, it also, the agreement includes modern, high-quality services frameworks and commitments that will mean greater service opportunities in both countries. I think there are a number of very good New Zealand businesses that can take advantage of that. A most favoured nations provision, which means that should Korea give better treatment to other similar nations, they must also extend that to us. So in as far as negotiations others will have in the future, a very large degree of future proofing. And it also includes commitments to facilitate the movement of business people between New Zealand and Korea. And I think that's another important aspect that's often overlooked in a new, modern, responsive FTAs and their negotiation. It's actually not just any longer about tariff line, it's about facilitating business and giving New Zealanders better treatment when they go into other countries. I'd finish, Mr. Speaker, by saying we're a very fair nation. We don't have that many tariffs in place for goods that come into New Zealand. But we are a country of very able producers. We're a country of traders. As a government, we need to make sure, with other members of this House, that we look at the very best way to ensure these great producers and traders in New Zealand have at least the best chance at a level playing field in other parts of the world. There are still far too many countries that have significant barriers in place that we view as unreasonable and unfair. That's the reason I commend this bill to the House and the Free Trade Agreement, which is good for New Zealand. Thank you.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is the only piece of legislation that comes before the House in response